Okay, Anthropology 155 students, here we go with our first lecture online from Muckle, Chapter 7. We're doing Archaeology of the Last 5,000 Years. First, we'll talk about civilizations, how they rise and how they fall. Then we'll talk about distribution and populations of people around the world over the last 5,000 years. Then we'll talk about diversity and wrap up with North American prehistory. So, ancient civilizations. We have five elements of civilization. Conventionally speaking, Muckle likes to talk about city or cities, one big city or numerous cities. Typically, we also talk about monumental architecture. So we have, giant pyramids or temples or whatever. Then an agricultural economy. So the subsistence is based on agriculture, which yields huge food surpluses. Um, which enables us to have these huge populations of people not working at getting food, but rather building cities and stuff. Then we have the state level of political organization um, with the coercive political apparatus, and finally a writing system, often the key element that distinguishes an ordinary state like, I don't know, Cahokia from a civilization like the I don't know, the Maya or Aztec or something like that, is this writing system. Um, okay, so an empire then is a state that dominates other states. State, we have definitions here. When we're talking about a state in political science or in anthropology, we're not talking about the U.S. states. So the U.S. states are smaller areas within the United States. So the United States is the actual state by political science, and Ohio is a region or a district or some sort of smaller um, smaller space within that state. Even though we use the word state in American English to talk about these cantons or regions, they're not actually states by the definition of political science. A state is a human entity that legitimates coercive power. Remember when we talked about what happens if you just sit in your classroom and decide not to leave? You're not hurting anyone, you're not threatening anyone, but the state, that is the city of Hamilton, or the state of Ohio, or the U.S. federal government, any of these political entities have agents of coercive power who are armed, who can arrest you, who can use violence against you, deprive you of your property or your freedom coercively. So this is how we define a state: a political entity that legitimates coercive power. Anybody can use coercive power. If you're living in a chiefdom or a band or a tribe, you can have someone come up to you and hit you and take your stuff away. The point about the state is that it says this is legitimate. Any of those bands or tribes, they would say, hey, you can't just take people's stuff away. They have to give it up voluntarily. And if they refuse to give it up voluntarily, then they get shunned, right? They're out. Uh, but that's the only power that any ordinary human organization has prior to the state. Once you get to the state, they have that power to take it away and to say, yes, it was a good thing. It was a good thing that we took it away. Um, Another example, the only entity that can legitimate the use of violence. When we first moved to Ohio, we were living in Ohio in 2012, 2013, and here I'll make my face big so you don't have to look at the page here. So I was reading the newspaper online, and it was talking about a violent effect, a violent act that had taken place in Kentucky. So in northern Kentucky, an old man was in his home and he had his basement. It was getting broken into every morning at 2 a.m. and he was mad. So he sat downstairs one night with a shotgun, and when they broke into his basement through the window and came up the stairs, as soon as the doorknob turned, he just let him have it. Both barrels, kaboom. And then he reached over, picked up his phone, called 911, said, "Hey, I just was broken into and I shot him." And he heard lots of noises. They're running out back through the window. back into their car, drove away. The police came, um, saw what had happened. Did they arrest him? Did anything happen? It's Northern Kentucky in 2012, 2013. Nothing happened, right? So what is that called? That's called castle doctrine. Um, Usually, when you're threatened with someone who is trying to hurt you, you have the prior to maybe 20 years ago, um, you had the responsibility to try to escape. Right? You can't use deadly force. Uh, you have to try to escape first. So then they started castle doctrine. So you have to try to escape first unless you're in your own home, and then you can use deadly force without any threat at all. So if someone is in your home under castle doctrine, you can kill them and get away with it, right? Because you're in your own house. Um, Interestingly, at the time, the journalist was careful to note that this was only the case in Kentucky. That in Ohio they didn't have castle doctrine yet, but of course that was in the works. And so I don't know, 2015 or something like that. They passed that in Ohio as well. If you're in your own home and someone turns up, you do not have the right to say, "Hey, you leave. I'm armed. Fire a warning shot." You don't have to do that. You just kill them, and that is Ohio law now. What they had in Florida was the next level of that. That if you are outside of your own home and you feel threatened in any way, you don't have to give any warning. You just kill them, and that's called stand your ground. And so these are all regularly challenged, right? So somebody comes up, they're a sheriff, and they say, "Well, I'm not really sure that when you killed that person, you felt threatened. I thought you were maybe trying to steal something from them, or were just being negligent. So I'm going to arrest you, right?" And so that's the first level: is you arrest, or if he thinks about it and then comes back later and says, "Oh, I'm going to file charges against him for shooting someone." Um, these are all level, and then of course, a grand jury can indict someone after hearing about it. Um, and then there's a trial, right? And so they could have arrested the old man and tried him, and then a jury of his peers could have said, "Yes, of course, this is castle doctrine. He felt threatened. He didn't know if they were armed or not, but he felt threatened. So when he pulled the trigger, he was entirely justified." And then he's let off right after a trial. So the point is that when the state legitimates this violence, when the state says, "No, that was a good thing. When you killed that person, that was an excellent thing. Do that every time." That is the state legitimating violence and saying it's okay. Good job. Way to go. Kill them. This is important to remember because we are all citizens and we vote for the people who pass these laws. Um, and if we legitimate that violence, then that's on us as well. So political science is one, a sovereign independent political entity that controls a 2 geographical territory with 3 clear political boundaries, and that uses 4 a police force to maintain internal control, and 5 a military to defend against external threats. So these are the 5 elements of political science, and that's 5 elements of a state, and that's it in a nutshell right there. Um, 6 early sites of civilization. We have Mesopotamia, which is in Iraq today, the Sumerian people, 5,100 years ago. This is the very first writing system in its cuneiform. In Egypt, 5,000 years ago, we have the Pharaonic Egyptians coming up with hieroglyphics. The Rosetta Stone is in there, and if we were in class, I would bring out my Rosetta Stone, which is unfortunately still in my office, which is locked up now. I have a replica of it, about, I don't know, yay big. Crete, the Minoans of Greece. We should have the map up here. But I'm going to stop right now and do this in a couple minutes. Hang on, folks.